Hey everybody, this is a chapter from Marx and Russia, The Fate of a Doctrine. Uh, it's titled Trotsky and Permanent Revolution. If I did say that this is by James D. White. Anyway, I'm reading this as part of my master's research. Lev Davidovich Bronstein, whose pseudonym was Leon Trotsky, was born on the 25th of October 1879 in Kherson in the Ukraine. In Nikolaev, where Trotsky spent his first school year, he joined the Southern Russian Workers' Union and carried on propaganda and educational activities among the local workers. On his outlook at the time, he wrote in 1922 to the historian V.I. Nevsky, quote, "In 1896 to 97, I considered myself an opponent of Marx, whose books it is true I had never read. I judged Marxism from Mikhailovsky's perspective," end quote. Wikipedia says Vladimir Ivanovich Nevsky lived from 1876 to 1937 and was a Russian revolutionary, Bolshevik functionary, Soviet statesman, professor, and historian. Back to the text. Trotsky's first wife, Alexandra Skolovskaya, recalls that Trotsky and his friends were furious with Plekhanov for what they considered to be unwarranted attacks on Mikhailovsky. At the New Year's Eve celebration of 1897, Trotsky proposed the toast, quote, "A curse on all Marxists and all who bring aridity and cruelty into all walks of life," end quote. The signs are that in this early period of his career, Trotsky shared Mikhailovsky's opinion that the Marxists were indifferent to people suffering in face of the inevitable development of a capitalist economy. In 1898, the members of the Southern Russian Workers' Union were arrested and Trotsky spent 2 years in Odessa prison, where Trotsky espoused Marxism and adopted the name of one of the warders as his pseudonym. Trotsky was sentenced to 4 years' exile in eastern Siberia, but in 1902, Trotsky managed to escape and make his way to London, where he made contact with Lenin. Trotsky had already demonstrated outstanding literary talent, earning him the sobriquet, the pen. Accordingly, Lenin invited Trotsky to contribute to Iskra and even to join the paper's editorial board. This invitation, however, was vetoed by Plekhanov, who suspected Lenin of trying to take control of the editorial board by ensuring the predominance of his supporters. In his reminiscences of Lenin published in 1924, Trotsky recalls discussing Bogdanov's writings. Trotsky gives an interesting insight into how they were viewed by Lenin and himself before Bogdanov's conflict with Plekhanov had escalated. He writes, quote, "I also told him how we had read Bogdanov's first philosophical books with great interest. I remember very clearly the import of Vladimir Ilitch's remark. He too thought that the book, The Historical View of Nature, seemed very valuable. But Plekhanov did not agree with it, saying it was not materialist." At that time, Vladimir Ilyich had no views of his own on this question and only repeated Plekhanov's opinion with respect for his philosophical authority, but also with some perplexity. I too was very surprised then by Plekhanov's verdict. End quote. Trotsky. As a delegate for the Siberian Social Democratic Union, Trotsky attended the Second Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. At the Congress, Trotsky initially supported Lenin, but in the course of discussing the first clause of the party program on the definition of a party member, Trotsky abruptly changed sides and took the part of Martov. Trotsky noted the emergence of two ideological currents at the Congress. Lenin and Lenin supporters were, quote, hard Iskrists, end quote, while Trotsky himself and the Siberian delegation belonged to the, quote, soft Iskrists, end quote. Trotsky was struck by the, quote, lust for power, end quote, which guided Lenin's actions at the Congress, in particular his efforts to ensure the independence of the Iskra, the, quote, central organ, against possible pressures from the Central Committee. In order to do this, Trotsky reasoned, Lenin had to eject from Iska's editorial board those members of it who recognized the preponderance of the Central Committee. This episode was the one in which Lenin overplayed his hand and precipitated the split in the RSDLP into two rival factions. Trotsky's contemporary observations on Lenin's behavior at the Second Congress are instructive about what the issues at stake at the Congress were, and in particular, about where Lenin's priorities lay. Trotsky has no doubt that Lenin's intention was to control the party from his power base in the party newspaper. This is consistent with the importance Lenin attached to the role of a party newspaper and what is to be done, and with his later predilection for the position of editor in party newspapers. In 1904, Trotsky returned to the theme of Lenin's political theory and practiced in a lengthy art critique entitled Our Political Tasks. This is a remarkable document for the insight it has into the manner in which what is to be done departed from the principle of the First International, that the emancipation of the working class is the affair of the working class itself. Trotsky does not refer explicitly to this principle, and it is possible that he did not know it, as his familiarity with Marx's writings in this period was limited. But what Trotsky says is Marxist thinking expressed in different words. In Our Political Tasks, Trotsky explains that his intention is to draw attention to the difference in principle which separates two opposing approaches to party organization. Quote, in the one case, we have a party which thinks for the proletariat, which substitutes itself politically for the proletariat, and on the other we have a party which politically educates and mobilizes the proletariat to exercise rational pressure on the will of all political groups and parties, end quote. Trotsky's second type of party could describe all the organizations from Land and Liberty down to the Brezhnev group, which saw themselves as subsidiary to the labor movement. Wikipedia says Mikhail Brezhnev was a Russian revolutionary Marxist explorer and an early leader of the Russian Social Democratic movement from which the Bolshevik organization and the Communist Party of the Soviet Union originated. Back to the text. Trotsky's first type of party describes the kind of organization that Lenin advocated and what is to be done. It was one which claimed to know what the workers' interests were better than the workers themselves. In a remarkably prophetic passage, Trotsky showed what the outcome of, quote, substitutionism, end quote, would be, quote, in the internal politics of the party, these methods lead, to the party organization, quote, substituting, end quote, itself for the party, the Central Committee substituting itself for the party organization, and finally the dictator substituting himself for the Central Committee, end quote. Trotsky. From his exile in Geneva, Trotsky watched events leading to the 1905 revolution unfold. At the end of 1904, he wrote a number of articles which were published in 1905 under the title Before the 9th of January. I'm going to look that up. In this pamphlet, one can discern the beginnings of what later would become the theory of permanent revolution. Trotsky said that what inspired Trotsky was Plekhanov's dictum that the, quote, Russian Revolution would triumph as a workers' revolution, or it would not triumph at all, end quote. Trotsky. And in fact, there is an echo of Plekhanov's words in Trotsky's declaration that, quote, Russian democracy can only be revolutionary democracy, or it can be no democracy at all, end quote. Trotsky. The context in which this idea occurs is an analysis of the weakness and timidity of Russian liberalism and Russian liberalism's inclination to come to terms with the autarky rather than strive for the autarky's elimination. Trotsky's argument was that in Russia, democracy could only be revolutionary because the country had no official institutions from which a democratic Russia could trace its ancestry. Russia had only two types of political institutions. On the one hand, there was the monarchy, supported by a colossal multi-branch bureaucratic apparatus, and on the other hand, there were the so-called organs of local self-government, the zemstvos, in the countryside, and the dumas in the towns. The liberals intended to build the future Russia on these two historic institutions. Constitutional Russia must, according to them, arise out of a contract between the autocracy and the institutions of local self-government. But according to Trotsky, this kind of compromise would deprive Russian democracy of the possibility to be based on national traditions. It would be called into being by a simple decree from above. Democracy could not be based on the zemstvos, because the zemstvos were not democratic. They were composed of the upper social strata and required the ownership of property to be a member. Democracy worthy of the name must recognize popular sovereignty, so that any attempt by the zemstvos to speak on behalf of the people and form pacts with the autocracy must be branded as political imposture. But the people had no legal forms to express their sovereign will. These could only be created by revolutionary means. The demand for a national constituent assembly was a break with all the official tradition of Russian history. By calling the sovereign people onto the historical stage, democracy was driving the wedge of revolution into Russian legal history. The inference Trotsky drew is that, quote, we have no democratic traditions, we have to create those democratic traditions. It is only possible to do this by revolution. A party of democracy can only be a party of revolution. This idea should penetrate the general consciousness, must fill our political atmosphere. The very word democracy must be suffused with the content of revolution, so that by coming into contact with it, it cruelly burns the fingers of the liberal opportunists, who try to assure their friends and enemies that they became Democrats as soon as they were called by this name. End quote. Trotsky. Whereas in the first articles in the Before 9th of January collection, Trotsky emphasized the incapability of the Russian liberals to take the lead in overthrowing the autocracy and establishing a democratic regime. In the article, The Proletariat and Revolution, Trotsky predicted the leading role of the working class in the coming revolution. Trotsky did this on the evidence of a number of strikes that had taken place in the course of 1903 in response to the hardship and deprivation caused by the war against Japan. At the moment, it was the liberals who were making the running as the force opposed to the czarist autocracy. But Trotsky believed the liberals ought to step aside and allow a workers' revolution to take place. Trotsky tried to have his pamphlet published by the Mensheviks printing press, but the Mensheviks were riven by internal conflicts, some favoring and some opposing an alliance with the liberals, with the result that the publication of the pamphlet was delayed. While it was in its proof copy, it was read by the Russo-German Social Democrat Alexander Helphand, who wrote under the name of the pseudonym of Parvis. Parvis was impressed by Trotsky's analysis and contributed a foreword to the pamphlet in which he amplified the points Trotsky had raised and placed them in the broader context of Russian and European social and economic development. New section, Parvis. According to Parvis, political radicalism in Western Europe was a characteristic feature of the petty bourgeoisie, the artisans who made a major contribution to the industrial development of their respective countries before being overwhelmed by the capitalist class. It was artisans like these who created the towns in Western Europe, which for several centuries reflected the culture and the political attitudes of the petty bourgeoisie. In Russia, on the other hand, towns developed more on the Chinese than on the European model. They were administered centers bearing a purely bureaucratic character, without the slightest political significance, and as regards economics, they were trading bazaars for the gentry and peasant environment that surrounded them. Their development, moreover, was arrested by the growth of capitalism, which began to create large towns in its own image, that is, factory towns and centers of world trade. As a result, in Russia there was a capitalist bourgeoisie, but not the intermediate bourgeoisie, which had given rise to the political democracy of Western Europe. Like Trotsky and before him Plekhanov, Parvis believed that in Russia only the workers could bring about the revolutionary overthrow of Tsarism. The revolutionary provisional government in Russia would be a government of workers' democracy. But Parvis cautioned it must prepare for the civil war which would follow the overthrow of Tsarism. There would be an assault on the workers' government by agrarian and bourgeois liberalism, and treason could be expected from the side of the political radicals and Democrats. A social democratic provisional government, Parvis believed, could not bring about a socialist revolution in Russia, but it would be able to destroy the autocracy and establish a democratic republic. Such a provisional government, Parvis thought, would embark on the lengthy process of transforming Russia politically, but he did not specify how this process might end. On the 9th of January 1905, the massacre of a peaceful demonstration in St. Petersburg provided the common cause that Trotsky thought was needed to trigger the workers' revolution. A wave of strikes erupted throughout the country in protest, leaving the liberal opposition movement on the political sidelines. The final article in Trotsky's pamphlet was one expressing satisfaction that his prognosis had been proved right. He welcomed the onset of revolution, whose first step, he declared, had lifted the people over scores of steps, which in normal times would have been prolonged and laborious to ascend. New section. Results and prospects. Trotsky returned to Russia in October 1905, just as the St. Petersburg Soviet was being formed, and in this organization Trotsky played a prominent part. For Trotsky, the Soviets, which sprang up all over Russia, were a confirmation that the workers themselves could act as an independent revolutionary force. In December 1905, along with Bogdanov and other members of the Soviet's executive committee, Trotsky was arrested and imprisoned. It was during this imprisonment that Trotsky wrote Results and Prospects, a work that developed the ideas of Before 9th of January into his theory of permanent revolution. Like Before 9th of January, Results and Prospects concentrates on two main points: the character of Russian historical development that would bring the proletariat to power, and the dynamics of the workers' government that would lead it in a socialist direction. However, the scope of Results and Prospects is much wider than Before 9th of January. It goes far beyond showing that the workers, rather than the liberals, are capable of establishing a democratic regime in Russia. It seeks to show that the peculiarities of Russia's historical development make it possible for the workers to come to power, and that the logic of their situation would compel them to introduce socialist measures. For the workers' government to survive, it would have to call upon the help of the proletariats of foreign countries, and in this way to make the revolution international. In speaking of Russia's historical development in Results and Prospects, Trotsky repeats what Trotsky had said in Before 9th of January about the relative weakness of the bourgeoisie and the strength of the workers. Trotsky makes Parvis's point that Russian towns, unlike towns in Western Europe, had no commercial functions, but were mere administrative centers like those found in Asia. In Before 9th of January, Trotsky had mentioned the dominance in Russia of the state apparatus. In results and prospects, this phenomenon was accorded much greater prominence. In this respect, Trotsky was following a well-established tradition in Russian historiography, since the conception of a strong, centralized state structure had been put forward by Soloviev, Klyuchevsky, and most recently by Milyukov. In Trotsky's view, what accounted for the emergence of a powerful state apparatus had been Russia's encounters with its more powerful neighbors, Lithuania, Poland, and Sweden. As a consequence of military pressure from Western Europe, the state swallowed up an inordinately large part of the country's resources, absorbing the incomes of privileged classes and so hampering their already slow development. It taxed the peasantry to excess, and thus impeded the growth of the population and the development of the productive forces. So the corollary of the burgeoning state was the continued poverty and backwardness of the rest of society. However, in order to exist and function, and to acquire the resources it required, the state needed a hierarchical organization of estates. This is why the state sought to force the development of these structures by government measures. In order to be able to survive in the midst of better armed hostile countries, Russia was compelled to set up factories, organize navigation schools, publish textbooks on fortification, and so on. From the end of the 17th century, the state strove with all its power to accelerate the country's natural economic development, creating new branches of handicraft and machine industry, and pursuing a policy of protectionism. According to Trotsky, quote, the more government is centralized and the more independent that government is of society, the sooner that government becomes an autocratic organization standing above society, end quote. Trotsky. Of course, such a state, Trotsky argued, would be a powerful lever for revolution in the hands of the proletariat. Every political party worthy of the name, Trotsky declared, strove to capture political power and thus place the state at the service of the class whose interest it expressed. The Social Democrats would strive for the political domination of the working class. Having come to power and acquired a powerful state mechanism for transforming society, the Russian workers were unlikely to relinquish that state willingly and turn the state over to the liberals. Even if the workers' government tried to limit itself to the democratic reforms of the Social Democratic Minimum Program, it would not succeed, but would be forced to implement socialist measures. Trotsky explained how this would come about in the case of the peasantry. An overthrow of the autocracy, the workers' government, would stand before the peasants as their liberators. But when the government introduced legislation to protect the agrarian proletarians, this would meet resistance from the peasantry as a whole. The proletariat would then find itself compelled to carry the class struggle into the villages, and in this way to destroy the community of interests existing in peasant society. The logic of events would impel the workers' government towards the introduction of cooperative production under communal control or organized directly by the state. This, Trotsky remarked, was a path leading to socialism. A similar situation would arise in industry. Trotsky could imagine a situation in which the workers' government would attempt to introduce an 8-hour working day, a measure included in the minimum program of the Social Democratic Party. The response of the capitalists might be to close the factories and make the workers unemployed. In that case, the workers' government could expropriate the factories and organize the production in them on a socialized basis. A similar scenario would emerge if the workers' government introduced measures to protect the unemployed, so depriving the capitalist class of its reserve army of labor. In this case, too, the employers were likely to resort to a lockout, and the workers' government would reply by the expropriation of the factories and the introduction of communal production. But there were limits to how far the socialist policies of the working class in Russia could go, considering the country's low level of economic development. Sooner or later, they would run up against the obstacle of Russia's backwardness. It was therefore Trotsky's conviction that, quote, without the direct state support of the European proletariat, the working class of Russia cannot remain in power and convert the working class of Russia's temporary domination into a lasting socialistic dictatorship, end quote. Trotsky. New section, Russia in the Revolution. In 1909, Trotsky published a collection of articles from the period of the 1905 revolution under the title Russia in the Revolution. The first 4 chapters, Russia's social development and Tsarism, Russian capitalism, the peasantry and the agrarian question, and the driving forces of the revolution, considerably expanded on the historical section of results and prospects, and in so doing developed the theory of permanent revolution by supporting it with empirical data. The result was to produce an interpretation of Russian history that had permanent revolution at its core. The first chapter, titled Russia's Social Development and Tsarism, provides an explanation of why the Russian state played such a dominant part in the country's history. Here Trotsky repeats what Trotsky said in Results and Prospects, that under military pressure from its Western neighbors, the Russian state had been compelled to develop its industry and technology. In the book, Russia in the Revolution, Trotsky elaborates on how relentless the state was in building up its resources for external defense. It imposed arbitrary taxes on the peasants, which at all times were intolerably heavy, and to which the population was unable to adapt itself. In an implicit reference to Chicherin's theory of the origins of the peasant commune, Trotsky adds that to collect the taxes, the state introduced the system of mutual responsibility in the villages. Wikipedia says Georgy Chicherin lived from 1872 to 1936, was a Russian Marxist revolutionary and a Soviet politician who served as the first People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs in the Soviet government from March 1918 to July 1930. Back to the text. Surveying modern history, Trotsky gives additional instances of the Russian state responding to military challenges from abroad. Trotsky alludes to Peter I's Northern War against Sweden, which obliged him to reorganize the infantry along new lines and to create a fleet. The Crimean War brought Russia into conflict with the economically most powerful European states, England and France. It then became necessary to reorganize the army on the basis of universal conscription. Fiscal and military requirements played a large part in the liberation of the peasants in 1861. In its need for finance, the Russian state, from the time of Catherine II, relied increasingly on loans from abroad. Thenceforth, the European stock exchange became increasingly the source from which Tsarism drew its finances. The national debt grew to enormous proportions, so that by Trotsky's time of writing, the interest on loans absorbed approximately a third of the Treasury's net revenue. As the Russian state absorbed a disproportionately large part of the surplus product, it inhibited the formation of socialist states in the country. European absolutist monarchies reached the height of their power when the feudal aristocracy and the emergent bourgeoisie were equally balanced, and the monarchy could play one off against the other. In Russia, it was not the equilibrium of the economically dominant classes, but their weakness that made the Russian bureaucratic autocracy a self-contained organization. In this respect, Trotsky judged Tsarism represented an intermediate form between European absolutism and Asian despotism, being closer to Asian despotism than to European absolutism. Trotsky's conclusion was that the administrative, military, and financial might of absolutism, which enabled absolutism to continue existing after absolutism had outlived its original purpose, quote, despite and against social development, end quote, not only did not exclude the possibility of revolution, but also, on the contrary, made revolution the only possible outcome. Moreover, the fact that the growing power of absolutism was constantly widening the gulf between itself and the popular masses guaranteed that the revolution would bear an extremely radical character. In the chapter on Russian capitalism, Trotsky emphasizes the rapidity with which large-scale industry has been introduced into Russia by foreign investment, encouraged by the state. Whereas only 15% of existing Russian industrial enterprises were created before 1861, 40% had appeared during the last decade. There was no question of this industrial growth being, quote, natural or organic. It did not evolve gradually out of small-scale artisan industries, because the development of these industries had been prevented by the influx of foreign capital and technology. The industry that was imported into Russia was the most modern, the result of centuries of technological development in Western Europe. This was transported to Russia ready-made, so that Russia had no need to undergo all the social and economic transformations that had gone into its creation in the West. As foreign enterprises in Russia tended to be large-scale industries, the workforce they employed was correspondingly large. Unlike the peasants who were scattered over the entire countryside, the young Russian proletariat was concentrated in large masses in the factories and industrial centers. The possibility for concerted action by the proletariat was much greater than for the peasantry. So I just spilled some shit on myself. Sorry. Trotsky's treatment of the peasantry and the agrarian question makes it clear that there can be no suggestion that the countryside might be the source of an indigenous development of capitalism, because peasant agriculture provided most of the state's budget, which went towards defense and to subsidize foreign firms. The peasants were taxed to such an extent that not only were they left without any surplus, but the peasants were also in permanent arrears. The peasants had no means of farming more efficiently, as this would have required financial resources that were unavailable. In these circumstances, no social differentiation took place. In the, quote, Black Earth Zone, Russia's main agricultural area, there was only an equality of poverty. Wikipedia says the Central Black Earth region, or the Central Chernozem region, is a segment of the Eurasian Black Earth. I don't know if this is even the right one. Never mind, I'm not going to read that. Where am I? In these circumstances, no social differentiation took place. In the, quote, Black Earth Zone, and, quote, Russia's main agricultural area, there was only an equality of poverty. According to Trotsky, in the Russian countryside, there were 5 million men who could not find employment, as there was insufficient industry to absorb them. On the other hand, the poverty of the villages meant that the domestic expansion of industry was unthinkable without the expansion of the home market and an increase in the purchasing power of the population. In the fourth chapter, The Driving Forces of the Revolution, Trotsky presents what he believes are the implications of the future of the revolution, which flowed from his survey of the classes and groups in Russian society. Trotsky thinks that the bourgeoisie, whether foreign or indigenous, the intelligentsia and the peasantry are all incapable of being in effective opposition to the autocratic regime. Only the proletariat is capable of being the driving force of revolution, and in this sense the Russian Revolution is a proletarian revolution. Unlike in results and prospects, in Russia in the Revolution, there is no mention of the proletariat requiring international support. One can see that the dynamic behind Trotsky's version of modern Russian history is to show that Russia's indigenous social and economic development is weak, and that this precludes any social class but the proletariat organizing a successful revolution and coming to power. Trotsky wishes to show that any substantive economic development that there has been has come from outside, and that the proletariat is the product of the transfer of foreign capitalism to Russian soil. This version of Russian economic history is the direct opposite of Lenin's. In his Development of Capitalism in Russia, Lenin was at pains to emphasize that Russian capitalist development was entirely indigenous, that Russia was a country in which commodity production prevailed, and that capitalist relations in the countryside were causing the stratification of peasant society. Trotsky, on the other hand, takes the view that foreign investment in the Russian economy has made the development of indigenous capitalism impossible. Trotsky's arguments for this bring him close to the findings of Marx, Danielson, Vorontsov on the obstacles to the circulation of capital in Russia. The purchasing power of the peasantry is too weak to provide a market for Russian industry. Peasants are uprooted from the land, but are unable to find work in industry. For the purposes of his theory, Trotsky is inclined to emphasize external at the expense of internal development, but native capitalism was by no means insignificant, as in fact Trotsky concedes in the remark, quote, "The textile industry is less dependent on the state. That is why in 1905 Moscow, the textile city par excellence, showed a much fiercer, though not perhaps a more energetic, opposition to the autocratic bureaucracy than the Petersburg of the metalworkers," end quote. The dynasties of Moscow merchants, such as the Guchkovs, the Konovalovs, and the Krestovnikovs, and the Tretyakhovs, formed an influential group in the economic and political life of the country. I'm looking up these people, see if there's anything for them. There's probably not, but you know. Yeah, I don't think I'm going to find anything for any of these. Anyway, the dynasties of Moscow merchants sorry, where am I? These merchant families looked with some disdain on the representatives of foreign capital for their supine attitude to the autocracy, and saw themselves as the genuine Russian business elite. They would also play a prominent part in the 1917 revolution and were well represented in the provisional government. New section. Plekhanov's History of Russian Social Thought. Trotsky was not alone in regarding the Russian autocracy as a form of Oriental despotism. The idea appears in the introduction to Plekhanov's main work of the time, his History of Russian Social Thought, which was published in 1914. Not seeing any description for this book. Because Plekhanov held that all forms of thought were dependent on material conditions, that it was being which determined consciousness. Plekhanov considered it necessary to place Russian intellectual development within the context of the country's social evolution. Plekhanov therefore prefaced his work on intellectual history by an essay delineating the historical evolution of Russian society, presenting, in fact, Russian history from what he believed to be a Marxist point of view. The most striking feature of Plekhanov's interpretation of Russian history is the enormous power and influence Plekhanov attributes to the state. Indeed, Plekhanov likens the Russian autocracy to the despotisms of the Orient. Plekhanov's materialist method consisted in showing how much an Oriental despotism was produced by Russia's social and economic development. Plekhanov's explanation was that the strong, centralized state organization had emerged as a reaction to the incursion of nomadic and warlike peoples from the East. To account for its continued existence in later times, Plekhanov argued that Russia had been a colonizing country, but a colonizing country which had preserved a system of natural economy. Russia, in other words, had developed extensively but not intensively. Despite its successes in colonizing new territories, it had retained its ancient forms of social organization. Its peasant communes, and these, in the opinion of Friedrich Engels, had served as the pillars of despotism everywhere from India to Russia. Plekhanov's originality consisted in his characterization of Russia as an Oriental despotism. In other respects, his interpretation of Russian history had much in common with those of earlier Russian historians, such as Soloviev, Chicherin, and Klyuchevsky, all of whom had emphasized the dominant role of the state in Russian history. What is remarkable in this respect is that historians other than Plekhanov, who attempted to provide a Marxist interpretation of Russian history, such as Rozhkov and Pokrovsky, believed that it was mistaken to start from the assumption that the Russian state was all-powerful, and then with references to social and economic factors. To explain why this was so, they believed it was incumbent upon Marxist historians to show that the supposed independence of the state was illusory, and that what was all-powerful were the economic factors, which determined how the state functioned. They naturally considered Plekhanov's approach to be mistaken and un-Marxist. New section. Pokrovsky and Merchant Capitalism. From his earliest publications, Pokrovsky had contested the idea of a supra-class Russian autocracy, first as a liberal, then as an ardent an adherent of, quote, economic materialism, end quote. Following the 1905 revolution, Pokrovsky had been a member of Bogdanov's forward group, but had left it due to disagreements with Bogdanov over proletarian culture. He then allied with Trotsky, collaborating with him on the newspaper Nasze Slovo, Our World, during the First World War. Around this time, Pokrovsky adopted the theory that the actions of Tsarism had been motivated by the interests of merchant capital. Following the October Revolution, Pokrovsky occupied a leading position in the Soviet regime, being Lunacharsky's deputy at the Commissariat of Education. Pokrovsky had raised no objections to Trotsky's The Revolution in Russia, while it remained in its German version, but when it reappeared, Pokrovsky had raised no objections to Trotsky's The Revolution in Russia, while The Revolution in Russia remained in The Revolution in Russia's German version. But when The Revolution in Russia appeared in Russian in 1922 under the title of 1905, it could not be ignored. Trotsky's scheme of Russian history, like Plekhanov's, was the diametrical opposite of what Pokrovsky had long held. Moreover, Trotsky's version of Russian history contradicted what Pokrovsky taught to his students. The problem, as Pokrovsky saw it, was that, quote, Trotsky's book will be studied, and we are dealing with an author whose every word carries extraordinary weight. whose every pronouncement in the book will be imprinted on thousands of young minds. And due to the lapidary artistic style in which the book is written, the impression will be so lasting that it will not be erased by the dozens of books that are written with less artistic talent and by authors who carry less authority. End quote. Pokrovsky. It was incumbent upon Pokrovsky to produce some kind of reply, and this Pokrovsky did in a review article on Trotsky's book entitled, "Is it true that in Russia absolutism existed in spite of social development?" Pokrovsky opened this review with the declaration that, quote, "like every scheme which is clear and distinct, Trotsky's scheme is easily memorized and assimilated. And this is a great pity, for first, this scheme is not ours, and second, it is objectively wrong," end quote. Pokrovsky. What, Pokrovsky asked, is this scheme but that which Milyukov put forward without, and Struve with, Marxist terminology, and which has been so recently resurrected by Plekhanov's introduction to the history of Russian social thought? According to Pokrovsky, the theory of the superclass state was in keeping with the liberal policies of cadets like Milyukov or with Mensheviks who sympathized with the cadets like Plekhanov. But how was the theory to be reconciled with Bolshevik calls to the proletariat to seize power from the bourgeoisie when the bourgeoisie did not have power? It seemed to Pokrovsky that, quote, "we must fight most decisively against this theory, no less energetically than we now fight against religious prejudices. I say further, it is less important to prove that there was no historical Jesus Christ than that a supra-class state never existed in Russia," end quote. Pokrovsky. It is to Trotsky's merit, Pokrovsky considers, that Trotsky has not simply reproduced the argument about the centralized state being formed to protect Russia against the incursions of the Tatars, but he has substituted, quote, "the pressure of Lithuania, Poland, and Sweden," end quote. But Pokrovsky inquires, what could their motives be for attacking Russia? Citing memoirs of visitors to Russia in the 16th century, Pokrovsky argues that Russia in the period was a country in which trade was well developed and in which the Tsar and the ruling classes were involved. To Pokrovsky, the conflicts with Lithuania, Poland, and Sweden that Trotsky had mentioned were ones for Russia to secure trade routes, and it was for this purpose that military modernization was needed. From the facts adduced, Pokrovsky concludes that to speak of Russia's backwardness missed the point. Russia was, quote, "a new country seized with the development of merchant capitalism, and that it was necessary for it to find a place in the sun along with other well-established competitors. For this, Russian merchant capitalism had to rule the country with iron discipline and form a veritable dictatorship. The incarnation of this dictatorship of merchant capital was the Muscovite autocracy," end quote. Pokrovsky. Trotsky's reply to Pokrovsky's review took the form of an article entitled "Concerning the Peculiarities of Russia's Historical Development." It appeared in two parts, in Pravda 1 and 2, July 1922. It was an article which Trotsky later reproduced as an appendix to the second edition of 1905, and later still to all editions of his The History of the Russian Revolution. Trotsky, with reason, obviously considered the question of very great importance, for, in Trotsky's own words, quote, "in 1922, Pokrovsky came down upon the historic conception of the author, which lies at the basis of the theory of permanent revolution," end quote. Trotsky. Trotsky, no doubt, answered Pokrovsky at such length because it was an opportunity to restate his theory, this time following the successful October Revolution, which he took to be a vindication of his ideas. Now he was able to pose the question in terms of how it came about that the proletariat could come to power in a backward country like Russia. Trotsky conceded that Plekhanov's presentation of Russia's historical development was very close to his own, but that it's false to claim that Trotsky conceded that Plekhanov's presentation of Russia's historical development was very close to his own, but thought it false to claim that Plekhanov had used this scheme to justify a bloc with the cadets. Plekhanov had not drawn the conclusion from it that it was possible for the proletariat to come to power in Russia, but then neither had Plekhanov drawn any conclusion from another of his unquestionably correct propositions, namely, quote, the Russian revolutionary movement will triumph as a working class movement, or it will not triumph at all, end quote. As Trotsky observed, quote, Pokrovsky, flatly denies the primitiveness and backwardness of our economic development, and therewith consigns the peculiarities of Russian historical development to the realm of legend, end quote. Trotsky. In Trotsky's view, the reason for this oversight was that Pokrovsky was completely hypnotized by the comparatively extensive development of trade noticed by him and also by Rajkov in 16th century Russia. Perhaps the most telling, and certainly the most vivid part of Trotsky's refutation of Pokrovsky was his way of challenging the validity of the assumption that a high development of trade necessarily denoted economic progress. This he did, not by reference to history, but to his own experience of trading during his exile in Siberia and his acquaintance with a, quote, dictator of merchant capitalism, end quote. Quote, my Siberian employer, in whose office I entered Puds and Arshins for a period of 2 months, Yakov Andreevich Chernik, was in practically unlimited control of economic life in the Kirensk district by virtue of his trade operations. He bought furs from the Tungus natives. He bought church lands from priests in remote districts, and he sold them cotton, and especially vodka, He was illiterate, but a millionaire in the currency of the time. His dictatorship as a representative of merchant capital was unquestioned. He even spoke of the local indigenous population as, quote, my little Tungus folk, end quote. The town of Kirensk, was a place of residence for police officers of various rank, kulaks in a state of hierarchical dependence on one another, a variety of petty government officials, and a handful of wretched artisans. I never found any organized artisanal trade there as a basis of urban economic life. No corporations, no guilds, although Yakov Andreevich was officially listed as a, quote, merchant of the second guild, end quote. End quote. Trotsky. By his personal reminiscence, Trotsky made the point that his former employer, who was the living embodiment of the, quote, dictatorship of merchant capital, end quote, that Pokrovsky spoke of, operating conditions of extreme economic backwardness. Trotsky expressed surprise that Pokrovsky had objected only to the first chapter of his book, which dealt with Tsarism, and not the second, which was concerned with Russian capitalism, which was also a product of Russia's economic backwardness. Russian capitalism did not develop from artisanal trade via the manufacturing workshop to the factory for the reason that European capital, first in the form of merchant capital, and later in the form of financial and industrial capital, flooded the country at a time when most Russian artisanal trade had not yet separated itself from agriculture. Hence, the appearance in Russia of modern capitalist industry in a primitive economic environment, the dominant role of Western European capital in Russia's economy, and the consequent political weakness of the Russian bourgeoisie. It was these factors that made the defeat of the Russian bourgeoisie in 1917 possible. Now, in the aftermath of the revolution, Trotsky could add to his theory that Russian economic backwardness had left its mark on the proletariat. It did not have the traditions that Western workers had derived from the guilds. Russian workers had been hurled into the factory boilers straight from the plow. Hence their illiteracy, their lack of technical knowledge, of organization, of culture. These were problems the young Soviet government had to face. Trotsky concluded by pointing out to Pokrovsky an important aspect of Russian backwardness that had contributed to the downfall of Tsarism. This was the inability of the economy to respond adequately to the demands of military operations during the war. With the help of the Allies, Tsarism was able to deploy the most modern weaponry, but it did not have and could not have the means to produce these weapons, nor did it have the means of transporting them with sufficient speed by rail or waterway. In this respect, Russia was operating on a more primitive economic base than its enemies or allies. Following this exhaustive reply by Trotsky, the rest of the polemic became more repetitive, and more concerned with clarifying the respective standpoints, particularly on the problem of whether Tsarist Russia was a colony of the Western powers, a problem of major importance for Soviet historians later in the decade. In 1924, Trotsky published the essay Lessons of October, which questioned the right of some of the members of the Soviet leadership to exercise power. In the political struggles which followed, Trotsky's dominant position in the regime gradually diminished. That Pokrovsky's work played a great part in the struggle against, quote, Trotskyism is acknowledged by Trotsky himself. In 1937, Trotsky recalled, quote, the most prominent part in the struggle against, quote, Trotskyism was accorded to historical questions. These involved both the history of the development of Russia as a whole, as well as the Bolshevik Party and the October Revolution in particular. The deceased M.N. Pokrovsky must unquestionably be acknowledged as the most authoritative Soviet historian. For a number of years, M.N. Pokrovsky waged, with the vehemence peculiar to M.N. Pokrovsky, a struggle against my general views on the history of Russia, and especially my conception of the October Revolution. Everything written by the other, quote, communist critics on this theme was merely parroting the ideas of Pokrovsky, end quote, Trotsky. Trotsky's final formulation of his theory of permanent revolution formed the introductory chapter entitled Peculiarities of Russia's Development of The History of the Russian Revolution, published in 1931. This differed substantially from the corresponding chapter in Die Revolution in Russland, and 1905. The differences can be accounted for by events that had taken place between 1922 and 1928. Although the dispute with Pokrovsky may have had political overtones, it was nevertheless an exchange of genuine scholarly opinion. One can see from the defense of permanent revolution that Trotsky wrote in response to a denunciatory article by Karl Radek in 1928 that subsequent attacks were entirely politically motivated and misrepresented Trotsky's views in order to discredit Trotsky's views. The pamphlet in question, entitled The Permanent Revolution, reveals less about Trotsky's ideas than the scope and breadth of the campaign waged against Trotsky's ideas. Issues at stake were not just the application of Trotsky's theory to Russian history and politics, but also to the program and policies of the Communist International, in particular to its policies in China. Much space in the pamphlet is devoted to the argument that Trotsky's ideas on revolution did not differ greatly from Lenin's, as his opponents argued they did. A prominent theme that runs through Trotsky's The History of the Russian Revolution is that Trotsky was always in full agreement with Lenin at the key junctures of 1917, and that all the present-day leadership of the Russian Communist Party, Stalin, Bukharin, Kamenev, Zinoviev, disagreed with Lenin and opposed Lenin. The lesson to be drawn was that, from the time Trotsky joined the Bolsheviks, Trotsky was the best Leninist. A telling accusation that Stalin had made in 1927 was that Trotsky did not subscribe to Lenin's dictum that, quote, uneven economic and political development is a necessary law of capitalism, end quote. Trotsky's task in the chapter on Russia's historical peculiarities was to show that on this theoretical level too, Trotsky did not diverge from Lenin. In the chapter, Trotsky registered his agreement that unevenness is, quote, the most general law of the historical process, end quote. This declaration brings Trotsky into line with Lenin, but the function Trotsky assigns to unevenness is that of a general framework, the assumption that countries develop to different levels at different paces. Trotsky argues that from this universal law of unevenness, one can derive another law which Trotsky calls the, quote, law of combined development, end quote. This is a heading under which Trotsky can assemble the ideas that he formerly referred to as, quote, permanent revolution. Some of what appears in the chapter, Russia's Historical Peculiarities, is familiar from previous versions of Trotsky's interpretation of Russian history, but there are some significant differences. One is that a much smaller role is assigned to foreign capital in Russia's economic development, and a greater one to indigenous economic development. Here, Trotsky does not contend that the rise of commercial towns was forestalled by the influx of foreign capital, but by the fact that at the first sign of crowding, Russian peasants would go deeper into the forest or spread out over the steppe. In this respect, Trotsky borrows from Plekhanov the theory of Russia as a country which colonized at the expense of intensive economic development. Another difference was in the tone in which Russia's historical peculiarities were treated. Now they are presented as a particular instance of a more general law. Quote, although compelled to follow after the advanced countries, a backward country does not take things in the same order. The privilege of historic backwardness, and such a privilege exists, permits, or rather compels, the adoption of whatever is ready in advance of any specified date. Skipping a whole series of intermediate stages, savages throw away their bows and arrows for rifles all at once, without traveling the road which lay between those two weapons in the past, end quote. Trotsky. This change in focus was understandable because in recent years Trotsky had been applying his theory to countries other than Russia, to China in particular. Trotsky repeats that under pressure from the wealthier Europe, the Russian state swallowed up a far greater relative part of the people's wealth than in the West, so weakening the position of the possessing classes and allowing the Russian state to become almost an Asiatic despotism. However, there is no emphasis on the power and independence of the state and no suggestion that it could be utilized to transform society. This would have contradicted Lenin's contention that in socialist society, the state would, quote, wither away. Also, in accord with Lenin's thinking, Trotsky attributes a major historic role to the Soviets, which he compares to that played by the Bible in the Puritan Revolution in England and the idea of pure democracy in the French Revolution. It is also noticeable that in his 1931 chapter, Trotsky does not say that it was the weakness of the Russian bourgeoisie that brought the proletariat to power, but he does use the weakness of the bourgeoisie in another connection. This is to explain that in the failed Decembrist uprising of 1825, it was the progressive elements among the nobility that took the place of the bourgeoisie to limit the powers of the autocracy. Similarly, bourgeois liberalism played a very minor part in the liberation of the peasants in 1861. It was the landlords who owned factories who were the first to favor replacing serfdom by wage labor, and the reform was carried out by the bureaucracy aided by liberal landlords. According to Trotsky, the lesson to be drawn from these episodes is that, quote, the solution of the problems of one class by another is one of those combined methods natural to backward countries, end quote. Trotsky. This conclusion is not followed by any statement to the effect that in the case of the proletariat, no other class or group can effect its emancipation. Far from opposing, quote, substitutionism, end quote, Trotsky had incorporated it into his theory of permanent revolution. That's the end of this section. Thank you so much for listening.